Hey guys, well, it is really good to see you, and I'm excited today to be interviewing Nate Edmonds. And Nate, I want to give just a brief interview, and I told you
Sure.
earlier when we started this that it's going to be a very laid back, and I just want you to share your heart. Your
Love it.
story just so resonated with me when I was talking to my friend Larry Hagner,
Yeah.
and Larry introduced us, and he said, Big A, you've got to hear Nate's story. And just a little background about Nate. He grew up as the son of a minister, and Nate has served in various capacities in ministry himself now for about 25 years in writing music, traveled around the world with somebody that you're all going to know who this is, Joyce Myers. And I think that lasted maybe a couple of decades or close to it anyway.
Yes, sir.
And then in 2015 is where his story kind of picks up from there, and had a tragedy that struck his family back in 2015. We're going to be discussing that just in a few minutes. Currently, Nate is the worship pastor at Element Church out in Missouri. Many of you are familiar with it. It's 3 campuses now. They have about 4,000 on any given weekend. And fast forward a little further in Nate's story, he married Amy, and today they have 5 beautiful children. So Nate, welcome to this interview today, and I can't wait to hear more about your story. And recently he's written a new book called More Than All the Glories, and there's a worship soundtrack that goes with it. I've been listening to it this afternoon.
Awesome.
It is amazing. I had a little video up on the screen behind me, but a little technical difficulty. I wasn't able to share it, but be sure to check out his soundtrack as well. But fill in some of the blanks there, Nate, and tell us a little bit more about you. And let's go way back to maybe when you were a child growing up in a minister's home with 4 sisters, and tell us how that went.
Well, first of all, man, I just want to say thank you to you. It's such an honor. I'll never forget the first phone call we had where you instantly just started mentoring me, and I was like pouring into the vision of what I'm doing, and I so appreciate that, man. I can't even tell you. I took everything you said to heart and has already started implementing some of it. So I just want to say thank you for that. But
yeah, man, I really believe in what you're doing.
I appreciate that. Yeah, man, I grew up, my dad was a worship pastor just like I am, but he wasn't a vocational worship pastor. He always had another job. He was a volunteer pastor, essentially. And so I had 4 sisters, and my dad was so busy that, I was just talking on a podcast a couple weeks ago that he didn't know how to pour into me verbally, but he sure showed me what a godly man looked like. Right. And so just growing up in that, we were with 5 kids. My parents were both high school dropouts. My dad had just gotten out of prison when my parents met. And so they were thrust into this life with 5 kids and trying to support us. And so my dad did the best he could, but it was a bit of a roller coaster financially. And so I was in different schools every year or two. And man, when I set out on my own in my 20s, I had this vision to just be stable. I got my job through Joyce Meyer, and I just wanted stability in my life. And so I was with Joyce Meyer for 22 years. That was the one bit of advice my dad gave me. He's like, find something you love and stick with it. And so that's, but I grew up, man, my dad was just an anointed worship leader. And I don't know if you ever heard of Kent Henry, but that was my dad's idol when we grew up. And I just grew up laying under pews and rows of chairs while my parents led worship. And I just caught that fever. I always knew in my heart that I was going to do that someday. So I started playing drums behind my dad in church, and just went for it from there.
And then 3 days out of high school, you said, hey, I'm giving my whole life over to full-time ministry. Tell us a little bit about that. That was 25 years ago.
It's crazy, man. It was 1994. It's June 10th. I graduated on a Friday. And throughout my senior year, Joyce Meyer's team had been calling me. They were really small then. They had just gotten on TV. And they were doing like hotel ballrooms, basically. And my uncle worked there. And he kept telling me, Nate, I think they're going to build a band, and you play a couple instruments. You should audition. And so sure enough, I did. In 3 days out of high school, that Monday, I started working in full-time ministry, started traveling and playing bass, and just anything and everything that needed to be done, including cleaning the restrooms was my job, and working in the warehouse. And then I would just get to tour. And whenever they went on the road, they'd take me out to play bass or drums. And man, I loved just being a part of everything they were doing and watching it grow and being a part of the details of that. And I caught the fever for ministry and just helping people and watching them not just help people, but help people with excellence and integrity. They set a pretty awesome foundation for me.
Well, and you can decline to talk about this, but it was kind of interesting in your opening comments. You had mentioned that your dad had just gotten out of prison.
Yeah.
And so this is prior to you being born, after you were born, or
It was
would you
before I
mind
was born. Yeah.
giving us a little more details on that?
Yeah, man. He grew up as just in a rough, he had a rough upbringing. His dad was an alcoholic. And
Right.
I was just talking the other day, and somebody asked me about my dad and like the influence that he had on me. My dad, I've always had a hard time expressing his love for me verbally. He still can't say that he loves me. And so that's just kind of his upbringing. His dad would punch him in the face and say, only you can't say I love you to another man unless you're gay. That's what my dad does. That's
Sure.
kind of upbringing my dad had, you know?
Sure.
And so he had a long record when he was a kid, a juvenile. And when he turned 18, he bought alcohol when he was too young, and they put him in jail for it.
Wow.
And so he met my mom after that. And my mom was 16 and he was 18 when they got married. And so three girls, had me, then another girl. So we had five of us all together.
Had a big family right out of the gate. So that was good. I know what you're talking about, though. My dad had similar happenings in his life where he couldn't really tell me I love you, you know, is from that old crusty kind of military background. And so I get that. And so we teach guys today to really embrace their kids and tell them how proud they are of them and tell them that you love them. And, you know, and it's just kind of hard just working through that from a transition. Well, you did say something, though, that you had a creed.
Yeah.
And it was the life motto that really changed everything for you. Tell us about that creed.
Yeah, Big A. So I was living my dream, man. I when I started with Joyce Meyer, I was, like I said, just everything from cleaning restrooms to playing bass or drums. But by the time 2014 hit, I was actually leading worship for Joyce, and we were playing big venues, arenas, and traveling. And I got to write songs and put out records. And I was so thankful to God that I was able to provide for my family. My wife started staying home, taking care of the kids, and we built our dream house, this 3-car garage, and everything that we set out when we were kids, man. We were 18 years old. We said we want to have 2 kids and the boy first. And I wanted her to travel with me. So she did for 10 years. So we were like, I was so thankful. And everything, my dad jokes, he always says, man, tragedy just never hit your life. You lived kind of a fairy tale for 22 years.
Wow.
And so I'm sitting on my couch, man, just being thankful. It was the first day of the year. It was January 1st, 2014. And it wasn't this holy moment. I wasn't in meditation. I was just sitting on my couch. My kids were playing on the floor. And I, you know, we talk about this, the voice of God, like it's hard to explain, but it resonated inside my spirit. You need to ask me for a creed and a motto for your family. You're going to need that this year. And I just said, amen. Like, Father, what is it? And these words flooded my soul, man. I almost choke up even talking about it, but it was for his glory by his grace. And I felt this weight to those words. I couldn't explain it, but to me, like, it summed up all the human existence. Like, I live and breathe and exist for the glory of Christ, and I'm never going to be able to accomplish it without his grace. And so I made this plaque, man. It's about 6 foot wide. I still have it today. I put our family portrait above it. For his glory by his grace. And in my flesh, you know, I thought, well, sure, my music's going to take off and I'm going to keep writing songs and have some success with Joyce. And I'll do all that for the glory of Christ. And I know I've been a student of the Bible my whole life. I know I can't do that without his grace. And I would think that it was going to be like my success was how I was going to glorify God. But as I would be in my prayer time in the mornings, I would stare at that plaque and I just knew it was something heavier than that God gave me that creed and that motto for a purpose and for a reason that was bigger than I could see.
And then it happened, right? And let's talk about that, because that is the very reason that I wanted you to be on this interview. Tragedy struck your family in a grand way. Talk to us a little bit about that and what that day was like.
Yeah, so it's crazy, man. My wife and I talked about, we started studying different theology. We grew up very charismatic. And so I started studying like the reformers. And I didn't know why God led me to that. But he wanted me to have a new level of trust in him. And so I get this new theology where I trust that God is sovereign over everything, man. And so in that, we started going to a different church. God called us to a smaller church. I've been at Element since it started. You know, I was there the first 8 years, but for whatever reason, God called us out at that season to a much smaller, very communal based church. And in that church, everyone moved to the city it was in so that they could have community. So guess what? We sold our brand new house, our dream house. It sold in one day in a terrible market, got our asking price for it. I was out in the jungle leading worship and this house sold. And so this was July now of 2014, 6 months after this creed came. We got this 100-year-old house in the city where the new church was, and we're gutting this sucker. It was like a war zone. And Dana, my wife at the time, she says, Nate, I'm having trouble swallowing. I think I need to go to the doctor. So long story short, we call the doctor. They say, go to the emergency room right away. And I'll never forget, I was sitting outside the endoscopy room. And for whatever reason, I took a picture of that sign, the endoscopy sign, as I waited for her to come out. And they were scoping her to see what was going on. And there were 3 days of tests, couldn't figure out what it was. And the doctor brings me in. It's a huge operating room. It wasn't even like a waiting room. And there's nurses scrambling, and they're pulling this camera out of her. And he says, well, Nate, there's a huge tumor in there. I'm 99% sure it's cancer, but she's young. We'll treat it aggressively. I'd start the prayer chain. He pats me on the back and he walks out. And Dana she was just coming to, and she says, did he say cancer? And I said, yes, sweetie, he did. And she just melts in a puddle of grief. And in that moment, this man of God, this worship guy, I had a million questions, brother. I had a million questions for God. Well, like, how is this part of the plan? You know, how am I supposed to glorify you with my music and all these things with this, you know? And I almost had an arrogance, like, these things don't happen to us. This happens to other people. What is this? And I kind of went into shock as she started to express all this emotion, man. And we just, we couldn't believe it. It was shocking.
So you had a mentor at the time, and you said that he gave you some words of wisdom about this time when you really needed it. Share with everyone those words of wisdom.
Yeah, his name was Mike, man. And when I came out of the shock about 3 days later, we were still at the hospital, and her condition got so bad she couldn't eat anymore. The food wouldn't go down. This tumor was growing. And it was about 4 a.m, and they came into the hospital room, and they were poking and prodding her and running tests. And the shock finally wore off, and the reality of what we were facing hit me. And she went into the restroom, honestly, to vomit. And I walked in there with her, and I just broke. It finally hit me, like, what we were facing, that this was not a bad dream. This was coming at us like a freight train. And so as I'm crying, she says, Nate, you can't do this. I need you to be my rock. And so I said, okay, I need 10 minutes. And I kicked the door open of this hospital room, and I ran down the hall, and I was just looking for solitude. I'm crying. I'm embarrassed. And I fall on the floor of this men's restroom stall, and I'm crying uncontrollably. And I'm crying out to God, like, what is this, Father? What are you doing? How come you've allowed this? Like, I don't know what to do. We got 2 little kids, they're 6 and 8. And I couldn't control my emotions. So I called my mentor. And I can't speak, but he can hear me. And he just keeps saying, Nate, it's going to be okay. I'm with you, brother. God is with us, brother. We're going to face this together. And I hung up with him. And that day he showed up at the hospital room, and he said, I've got a word from God for you. And he said, God says that you need to rest in his sovereignty, but reach for his promises. And man, that changed it was everything I grew up with as a kid, that God is our healer, that I can trust him, that healing is a children's bread, and by his stripes we're healed. And I know that I can plead with the Lord for healing, but also, if he doesn't heal her on this side of heaven, I can rest in his sovereign will and know that, man, he's going to work all things together for my good, even this cancer. And suddenly those two theologies collided, and I had this peace I cannot even explain in the middle of utter chaos with my family, that I could rest in God's sovereignty, but still reach for those promises, man. And it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard in that moment. I'm just thankful for good mentors and men that can do that and can speak into your life.
Man, we all need mentors, don't we? We need people to walk with us and hold our arms up when we're tired, and give us those words of encouragement and edify us in times of need. And we talk about that in ISI all the time, is how important those relationships are, because like today, you don't need them. Tomorrow, you don't need them. But times are coming where we're going to need people around us to pick us up off of those stalls of the bathroom floor and embrace us and walk with us through these things, because we never know when these situations are coming. Well, out of that, the book, More Than All the Glories, was birthed.
Yeah.
And in chapter 6, I believe it is, you talk about moments of grace.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to all the ways that God comforted your family through the hardest seasons of your life.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about some of those moments of grace.
Yeah, I love that scripture. Blessed are those who mourn, for they are comforted. Like, that's a tough one to swallow, because for someone to mourn, someone's got to pass away. Someone's got to die. And it says we're blessed in that moment. And that's, now that I've lived through this, because I know that the comfort of God, the comfort of the Spirit of God is so beautiful and overwhelming. And you don't ever get to experience that unless something tragic happens, or you go through some hard times, you know? And so these moments of grace were times where we felt the sovereign hand of God lead us there. And then he met us there. And I always say, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, man, he didn't take us from the fire, but he sure met us in it.
Right.
And those moments of grace where God just met us in the fire.
Right.
And we went to Disney as a family, and I'll never forget Dana having both kids on a little scooter because she was too weak to walk, and I still have that image in my head of her loving on them. That was a moment of grace where God spoke to me and said, you're going to be okay, buddy. You're going to be okay. I'm with you. I'm not leaving you. And so we had tons of those. There was one where my little boy was skateboarding, and he got mad because he couldn't get on his skateboard, and he kept falling off it. And he yells out, he says, "Daddy, I hate this skateboard and I hate God." And this is a moment of grace where I had a choice, man. I could sit there with him and go, yeah, this sucks, buddy. I don't understand it either. Or I could have this grace and ask God for the grace, right? This forced glory by his grace to now mentor and speak into my little boy's life. So we sat down on the curb that day and we talked about how we don't understand why God allowed this. We know that we live in a fallen and a sinful and a broken world, but we know that God is going to use this for his glory, right? And so we made what we were going through a mission. And I told him about the thousands of lives that our story was touching online, and that we would post videos and people were coming to Christ and coming to know Jesus because of our suffering. And so we sat down and had this moment of grace, and we went in and we looked at all the videos and the things that people were responding to. And suddenly my little boy had a mission, and this moment of grace, man, where God just met us. And that night he prayed at dinner. We were about to go to church. We ate dinner before church. And he says, "God, I pray that we'll worship you as a family tonight." And I said, yes. Like you can't explain these moments, moments of grace where we would sit and talk as a family about our future. And with Dana, we would talk about what it might look like to have a stepmom, and what it might look like if God takes mommy home. And it's just things that are unexplainable when you haven't seen it or gone through it, but it's the grace of God that meets you in the fire. And it's precious. And I always used to say, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, and yet I'd wish it on everybody I love the most, because I've never felt the grace of God like that before.
You tell the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where God met them in the fire. And oftentimes we pray for the redemption. We pray to get out of the fire. But when Nebuchadnezzar said, "Bow down to me," they said, "No, there's no way we're going to do that." And they said, even if God doesn't take us out, blessed be the name of the Lord.
Yeah.
And that's what you were able to experience. You were in that where peace surpasses all of our understanding. You were at a place where God met you there.
Absolutely.
There's another chapter that I want to talk about just a little bit. It's chapter 9. It's called Precious Peace. And in this, you quote that very passage, Philippians 4:7. You say, "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." And if I can, with your permission, I want to read an excerpt out of chapter 9 just for a moment.
Awesome.
It said, "When I looked ahead to what life would be like after Dana's death, one of my biggest fears was the night of her passing." I hope I make it through this.
I love it.
I couldn't think of a lonelier feeling than that first night after our 19 years of marriage, going to bed alone. The deafening silence was in the room that we had once shared, now vacant and left with the empty bed that she had suffered in for so long. How could I possibly sleep there? How could I ever stand to be in that room again? What terror and grief would haunt me that dreadful night? But I climbed those stairs once again, those stairs that I had raced up and down every single day for 15 months, being a 24-hour nurse. Those stairs I climbed earlier in the day to hold her hand as she slipped away into eternity. As I climbed the stairs, this amazing and precious peace that settled into my heart. It wasn't dreadful at all. In fact, it was quite actually serene. The silence was deafening, and it was a cool breeze that was washing over my soul. The empty bed was like an empty tomb, a sign that she had risen. She wasn't dead any longer. Take us there just for a minute, Nate. I can only imagine, as you wrote in this chapter, the feelings that you had. Take us there just a little bit more.
Yeah, man, I had a friend that was introduced to me during the cancer, that his wife had passed away from cancer, I think 3 years before Dana did. And he spoke to me about that night. He said, "Brother, that's going to be a tough one. You need to prepare yourself for that. Because he felt this, he did not have the same experience. He had grief and just overwhelming sorrow that night. And so I had been praying, man, that the Lord would meet me there that night. And he did. And I can't explain that peace. It's like you said, that peace that passes all understanding. I went up in that room that night, and not just that night, but for days after the night she had passed, I slept like a baby. I had this overwhelming, I could sense the goodness of God in that room for days. And my pastor came the next day to help me plan the funeral. And he's like, "Hey, do you feel that?" And I said, "Oh yeah, brother, it's been here for days." It was just this peace that met us in our grief. And that's where, man, that's where this, my sovereignty doctrines just come in. It's like, I can't deny that God met us in that. And I don't understand it all. I don't have all the answers of why we had to go through some of that, but I just know that God was with us in it. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. I wouldn't trade that peace that I felt that now I can encourage others with. I wouldn't trade that for anything. And it was hard to explain, but we had this bed that had I had to sit her up. She would start choking and stuff. And I had this bed, and I just had all this memorabilia, right? Of just there was boxes stacked up of all the medical supplies and all that. And I just sat in there and thought, and I honestly I was thankful to God for the experience that we had together. And you can't explain that. That is a peace that passes all understanding.
Sure. You have to be there. God gives you the grace that we need when we need it to go through those things. You went on and even spoke and led worship at Dana's service.
I did.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I want to say too that there's a song called "Precious Peace" on the record that's probably my favorite on the record, that is about that moment. And it's it's acoustic, and it's just gorgeous, and you can feel the weight on that song. So, and you can read the story then behind it too. Each song on the record has a chapter in the book where you can read the guts behind the song. But
they are amazing too. I've been listening to them this afternoon, and absolutely they're amazing.
Thank you, sir.
You're quite the singer. So
thank you.
Yeah, it's good.
But yeah, man, I led worship. She asked me to do it. And again, my mentor, at first I said, no, there's no way I'll make it through speaking and singing at your funeral. Can't do it. And my mentor said, yes, you can. God will meet us there. And he's like, you need to go back and tell her you'll do it. And so I went back, and man, we sang. So there was a period where I got sick too from the weight of everything we went through. So she couldn't sing. Obviously, she had a tumor and a feeding tube and all that stuff. And I lost my ability to sing for 6 months, and the doctors couldn't explain it. I could talk, but I could not sing. And so she would be in pain at night, and the meds weren't working, and she would say, will you worship with me? And we would sing these songs like, "Oh No, You Never Let Go" by Matt Redman, and "It Is Well With My Soul." We would sing, but neither of us could do anything but whisper in the night, man. And we would just hold hands and sing, and we would worship God in our pain. And those are the songs we sang at the funeral because now I had my voice back, and I wanted to glorify God at that funeral. It wasn't sad. It was a celebration of a life well lived and a life that honored God up until her very last breath.
I was reading that in the book, and I was reading to where you talked about you just held each other and whispering through worshiping together. And I can only imagine you've probably never had a level of intimacy quite like that.
No. And
it was just a sense of encouragement in a different kind of way to think about worshiping even through whispering together. Well, a strange twist came out of that, right?
Yeah.
And you met Amy.
Yes,
and
sir.
Tell us how you met Amy, which I thought was a really cool story, and how you guys are doing today.
Man, God is so good and so faithful. And I know that everyone's story doesn't work out the way mine did, but for whatever reason, God was just particularly good to me. And it's hard to explain to people who haven't gone through cancer, but for 15 months, it was so bad that we knew, unless God parted the Red Sea, we were going to lose her. And even counselors would take us through that and advise us how to guide our kids through that. And so we grieved together, the four of us as a family. And she wanted to plan her own funeral. I thought it was the craziest thing ever. We would drive by every day to go to chemo. We would drive by this beautiful funeral home, and she'd say, remember, when I go, I said, that's the place I want to be. And I'm like, well, there's all these funeral homes in town. Why that one? She said, I don't know. I just know that that's the one. I think it's pretty. And so I said, okay. So a couple of weeks before she passed, she wanted to plan her own funeral. And so she was in and out of consciousness, and she was bald and in a wheelchair. And I wheeled her in there that day. And this amazing, gracious, sweet woman came around the corner and just sat with me and her and our 2 kids for 6 hours. 6 hours it took to plan this funeral. We had a dove release and balloons and all these things. And we just connected with her. And I remember the day we picked out the gravesite with our kids. We went to the grass and we said, okay, this is where mommy's going to be. And Dana had painstakingly done 2 videos a year for each kid. They one on their birthday and one on Christmas till they're in their 20s. And they get this little trinket with a scripture on it from mom. Well, she gave them the first one that day. We knelt down on that gravesite and we prayed and we asked the Father to lead us through this pain and lead us to this next season where mommy would be there at that gravesite, you know. And it sounds crazy to talk about it now, but off in the distance was Amy. And Amy was the funeral planner that sat with us and just held our hands through all this grief. And a few months after Dana passed, again, we grieved together, right, as a family. And about 3 months after Dana had passed, I saw Amy online and she said she was needing a new church, that she was going through a hard season of her life. And I invited her to come to our church, and that she came to our church. And that was the first night I realized how beautiful Amy was. I was a single man now. And I joke about it because I didn't know how to be that. I didn't even know what I was feeling. I was just like, I'm very drawn to this woman. She's stunningly beautiful. And she had a really rough story. And I just felt called to her. That's the best way I know how to explain it. And so a couple months went by and I went to New York. I told Dana after she passed, I wanted to buy an F-150 and a big dog, and I was going to take our kids on a trip. And so we did that. And on that trip to New York, I couldn't get Amy off my mind. And so I texted her. I still have a picture of it. It's in the book. And it said, I can't remember what it said. You're a puzzling woman, Amy. Tell me more about yourself. And suddenly we started texting like crazy. And a week later, when I got back, we went on our first date. And as crazy as it sounds, I knew on our first date that she was the one that God had brought me. Dana had actually prayed for my future wife, as crazy as that sounds, and blessed it. And so we had this permission to be okay, to move on. And so we did, man. 30 days after our first date, we got married.
What? 30 days?
30
Come
days.
On.
I don't advise this as a pastor, but listen, when I know it's God, I just run.
Yeah.
And I was in my journaling time with God. I was
Cool.
I was so afraid. It was 4:30 in the morning. I'm like, God, I'm either about to make the best decision of my life or the worst. I need you to guide me. And I just felt like he said, run to her. So I wrote in my journal that day in all caps, run to her. And so I proposed, man. And I don't know why we felt like we had to move so fast. Our kids wanted to live together and we just knew it was right. So we did it. And that's been 4.5 years ago now. We blended a family of 5 kids, 2 dogs, 2 cats. It's a big, crazy mess every day. And we love every second of it. And that's just the goodness of God, man. It's precious. I can't even explain it.
Tell us a little bit more about the book, More Than All the Glories, where people can find it. Tell a little bit more about the soundtrack that accompanies that, and tell us what's next for Nate Edmonds. Man,
it's so what got my family through that time was knowing that these moments right here, right now, were coming. We knew that we were going to glorify God with our story. I had a vision for this book. I thought it was going to be called For His Glory by His Grace, but honestly, Joyce Meyer said that title wasn't going to work. I need to come up with a new one.
Right.
So I thought I should take her advice. And this More Than All the Glories, it's never been used by anything, not a song, not a book. And it so encapsulates that God works all things together for good, more than I can ever hope or ask or think. It's more than any glory I could ever achieve is to walk with Jesus. And so the title just explains like it's more than every glory I could ever hope for. And so I got, being a worship guy, I did a worship album that accompanies it, and it's under the same title, More Than All the Glories. I got to write with amazing guys in Nashville that have just done big songs on the radio. God just opened all kinds of cool doors. And so there's a soundtrack, and the book's on Amazon and Kindle, and then you can get the soundtrack wherever digital music is sold. But it's the whole story from front to back. And I always say it's not just a sad cancer story, man. It's a story of hope, story of redemption. And as you see what God has done so far, we don't even have time to get into the blended family stuff and like this life of love that we're living. So about half the book is kind of the tough stuff, and the other half is like the redemption of God and just His goodness in the middle of everything that of the suffering, the things that we went through.
What is so cool to me that you didn't allow such a devastation to take you down. And you just turned to God and you said, hey, how can I glorify you out of this? You've written a book that is very transparent, very raw, very vulnerable, that you share the story and you share what you went through. Guys, if that doesn't give you some inspiration I can't even imagine going through that. But I'm so grateful that you took something that was devastating and made something amazing out of it. So, Nate, how can people reach out and find you if they want to contact you, if they want to have you as their guest, if they want to have you speak? How can they reach out and contact you?
Yeah, it's nateedmonds.com, NATEEDMONDS. It's nateedmonds.com, and all my social network stuff is on there. And that's what's next, man. I don't know. I love that you started telling me like all the different ways I could tell my story, and I started mapping that out and implementing that, because doing these podcasts has been a godsend. I love it. It's a conversation that we get to broadcast and talk about Jesus. And so looking for more of that, and ways to come to do some public speaking, and I have a lot of ideas for new books in the future. So I'm just praying that through. And I you talk about just kind of weaponizing your pain and the stuff that you went through, and letting that, as you did with your story, brother. Like I couldn't believe the stuff you told me about your story. It's just like, I want to take everything that we've been through, and I want to glorify God with it, and I want to help others with it. And that's been our hope this whole time. This for His glory by His grace. It's what keeps us going. And so we're trusting God to unfold that. I'm trying to not touch it and not have a huge plan for it. I want to have a vision, but I also want to just let God do what God does. I never thought I'd be sitting here with you. So it's just letting God open those doors, man, and see. Awesome. I just want to glorify Him, and whatever door He opens, I'm going to walk through.
Well, you've certainly done that today in spades. So thank you very much, Nate, for being with us today. And thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you, Big A. I really appreciate it.
Okay, buddy. We'll see you.
See you.